Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're discussing thematic elements. Today's discussion is theme. Theme is the overriding idea or controlling idea of a work. It is very often the author's intention for the work itself. Authors write stories and make speeches and create movies in order to explain their view of the world. And certainly when you're watching a television show or you're watching a movie or you're reading a book by an author that you've seen before, you begin to notice that there are certain storylines that get told over and again. There are certain ways that the characters are drawn that get told over and again. And very often this has to do with the author's perspective about human nature and the human condition. Theme is indeed an observation. It is not a directive. For example, in children's literature, especially fairy tales and things like that, you'll get a moral to the story. And a moral will say, do something like, look before you leap, he who hesitates is lost. And it's this idea that it's designed to give you instruction as to how to live your life. However, theme is not like that. Theme is merely an observation, and the author is leaving it up to you to decide whether or not you agree with that observation. They're not telling you that you must do something. They are simply saying, we do something. And then they present it in a way that's designed to make you think about it, which of course makes it more interpretive and rather less escapist and less obvious. To that end, what you're looking for is ways to find theme, and very often it is embedded in the symbolism, in the irony, in the conflict, in the character, in the setting of the story that you're reading. And of course understanding how the conflict and irony and setting, all explained elsewhere on the website, how these things work within the context of constructing a story help you identify the overall theme. Not all stories will have a theme, but ones certainly in this class usually do. And actually the mature reader, someone who's read a lot and someone who's been doing this kind of analysis a lot, will begin to find themes even in the most obviously commercial and escapist work, even your SpongeBob SquarePants, or if you're really heavy, if you're or a little bit older, Beavis and Butthead, or even older than that, the Three Stooges. This material, which was designed for entertainment purposes, it's designed for immediate gratification of some of the more baser instincts of human, mostly male human nature, in terms of jokes and slapstick comedy and such like that. There is still a discussion that the author is creating by the relationships between the individual characters, and whether we're talking about the relationship between Larry and Curly and Moe, or the relationship between Beavis and Butthead, or the relationship between Patrick and SpongeBob, and of course Mr. Krabs. The idea is that they're making an observation about human nature and about the way that we deal with each other by creating these characters in a very consistent way. What theme is not? Theme is not a moral. It is not a lesson. It does not tell you what to do. It just tells you what we do. And therefore a theme will not be written as a moral, but rather as an observation about the way that humans act with each other. It is not necessarily a distinction of right or wrong. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the author, for more controversial literature, and certainly for a lot of literature designed for a more mature audience, will point out not the good things that human beings do, but actually the bad things that human beings do, the inconsistent things that human beings do, the questionable things that human beings do. Generally, it is not the only reason the story was written. Obviously, stories are written for enjoyment, but very often it is an important reason as to why the work was written. For example, in What You Pawn I Will Redeem, Sherman Alexie is telling us this story about this guy who has to get this regalia back, and there's some humorous anecdotes about fights and passing out and vomiting up hamburgers and things like that that all of us enjoy. But as part of that, the author's themes about homelessness, about othering, about the status of the Native American in modern society are all brought home through that first-person narrative by the character. And it's the author's use of character and narrative voice and the symbolic aspect of the regalia itself and his interaction with various members of white culture that in a lot of ways is Alexie's discussion about the way that Native Americans are perceived and treated within the larger white culture. That means you can enjoy the story, and at the same time you may find elements where the author is saying, you know what, people do this thing, and people are sometimes untrustworthy, and people sometimes do the right thing for the wrong reason. etc., etc. Generally, a theme is not a cliche. Things like the grass is always greener on the other side is not a theme. That's a cliche. Instructional things like don't count your chickens before they hatch is not a theme. That's a moral. A theme is an observation, and generally would be stated in something like people generally will lie in order to preserve their image of themselves, or people will steal if they need to feed their children, something along those lines. It is this way where the character is going to reveal something about the way humans act with each other. It is not the truth. It is not the answer. It may be the author's perspective of life, but it is not necessarily any specific fact. It is the author's opinion. And therefore, what the Native American author writes about, and what the African American author writes about, and what the Anglo-American writes about, what a woman writes about, what a man writes about, may have different themes based on their own view of culture and view of what's right and wrong. There might be some overriding themes that are consistent between all of them. That's the nature of a theme. And in fact, a theme fits not only the story itself, but fits some general truth. And when you discuss the theme, this theme is not, there's a guy who has to get his regalia back, and he gets it back. That's not a theme. That's a plot line. The theme would be when people have a task, very often they can rise above their limitations, which is not only what happens in What You Pawn I Will Redeem, but also happens not in other stories as well as what happens in life. And your statement of the theme will be in this kind of more generalized way. Theme is one person's opinion. It is the author's opinion. It is often implied, repeated in abstract ways throughout the story through symbolism and conflict and character. It is an insight on life as perceived by the author and as portrayed by the author, designed to give us an understanding of how we act and how we perceive, and that's what makes it interpretive. That's what makes it literary. And can even question or refute the ideas held by the reader. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that you're going to read in my class is designed to question your view of the world. These authors want you to ask yourself whether or not the way you see things is actually the way they are. And certainly that's why we read multicultural material. That's why we read stuff from different eras, stuff from different gender identities. And the reason is because we're trying to see how different people see the world and therefore perhaps establish a better understanding as to how we ourselves see the world. Keep in mind that when you discuss a theme and when you present it in your paper, very often as your thesis statement, you will present it as a complete sentence. Death is not a theme. Death is often unexpected is a theme. Death can be relief from a painful life is a theme. Death is the most horrible thing ever is a theme. But death alone is not a theme. It is general. It is not so specific. It only applies to the story at hand. It is general enough to apply to life as well. It is not an absolute. It's not always, never, kind of thing. It is often, sometimes, can happen, may happen, rather than this is the way things are. It is unifying. That means you cannot ignore major elements of the story in order to make your theme. You can't. If something important happens in the story, for example, at the end of the story of Tooth and Claw, the character walks into a room that we can be fairly sure that there's still a dangerous animal. And he closes the door. He even says, I don't know why I closed the door. You can't say that he's going to fix his life and move on in order to fit the idea that this is a story about redemption. It's not a story about redemption. And in fact, if we put everything together, we realize that he changed his life for a short period of time because he got the girl and he got the cat. But when she leaves, he goes back to his old way of life. And in fact, it looks like he's actually committing suicide by walking into that room. Don't change the theme and try not to find an obviously happy ending for a theme. Most themes are not uplifting. Most of them are observations about life that most people don't observe, and a lot of times those are the negative aspects of life. Avoid cliches. Keep in mind there may be multiple themes. Sherman Alexie's work centers around homelessness. Why? Because he was homeless himself. It centers around alcoholism. Why? Because he was an alcoholic. It centers around being Native American. Why? Because he's Native American. And sometimes he mixes them together, and sometimes he separates them. If you look at a work like I'm a Mad Dog Biting Myself for Sympathy by Louise Erdrich, her work is often centered around Native Americans, but even if she does not mention a Native American in the work, as in our story, the plight of this outsider in a larger society is something she constantly writes about because she is coming from this perspective of being a person who is considered an outsider within her own country. And these are themes that she constantly writes about throughout her work. When you're writing a theme, like I said, make sure it's stated as a sentence, make sure it's a complete idea, and that it pulls everything together, and it's a great way to create a thesis statement for any work that you do for me. Stay in touch.